In 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre terrified audiences with its raw, unsettling portrayal of a certain family in rural Texas. Who can forget the first time Leatherface made his appearance in one of the most shocking scenes in horror film history? The film was reimagined twice, not counting the sequels, but something was lost. Maybe everything was lost. Why? Stick around, because we're about to explore why the sequels couldn't capture the same terrifying magic as the original. One of the key reasons the original still holds such power over audiences is its use of 16mm film stock. The 16mm film frame is only about 22% of a full 35mm Academy frame. In simpler terms, it's like filming with a modern iPhone. To distribute this film in theaters, the film has to be printed onto a larger 35mm print film, so it has to be interpolated, a process called blowing up. Obviously, blowing up 16 to 35mm isn't the same thing as filming in 35mm to begin with. The resolution and sharpness cannot be the same. The film grain is also blown up, so they look bigger on screen. The primary reason director Tobe Hooper decided to film in 16mm was to save money in film stock. And that's just one part of the story. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was shot on Eastman color reversal stock. Unlike negative film, which requires a printmaking process to view the final image, color reversal film can be viewed directly after development. Color reversal stock was used to achieve bright saturated colors. However, it has a smaller exposure latitude compared to negative film, meaning that it requires more precise control of lighting and exposure. Brighter colors are not something you want in a horror film, so why did cinematographer Daniel Pearl use reversal stock for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? He knew the film had to be projected in theaters, so it would be blown up. He had to pick a film stock that would look great regardless. By shooting a positive stock instead of negative, Pearl could skip creating an interpositive, so that's one processing removed from the chain. This maintains image quality better. The second reason was that this specific film stock had a fairly low contrast and finer grain structure than color negative films of the time. The last reason was to reduce the impact of film grain. 16mm film processing wasn't known to be clean, so dirt would creep in, and they turned up as white specks in the final film. White specks were more distracting than black specks of dirt, which is what you got with reversal film, so they ran with it. This combination of film stock processing and film projection is pretty much non-existent today. When they filmed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 10 years later, they picked 35mm film because the budget was higher, and it looks more like an 80s film than the gritty, realistic original. The first remake, released in 2003, was also shot by Daniel Pearl in, at that time, modern film stock. He chose a completely different style of cinematography because he didn't want it to look like the original. In the original, they hardly had any lights. The lights they had were tungsten and were used for the night scenes. Day scenes were mostly shot as is. For example, in the van, to maintain exposure in the foreground, the background was so blown out to white that it didn't matter if the van was moving or not when they filmed it. You couldn't see anything outside. It helped that they filmed in the harsh Texas sun, which gave them enough exposure. The night scenes looked like they used only one light and let everything fall into darkness. The film stock used was slightly low contrast, so they did try to get the best bang for their buck in the budget they had. Daniel Pearl also used dirt, which was kicked about by the actors or cars to add fill into the shadows and get silhouettes. The 2003 remake had access to HMI lights. He was able to light the van's interior to hold detail in the exteriors. He lit everybody, and the results are drastically different. It feels like a different world. Leatherface took a trip to another film set. The grain and texture of 16mm gives it a totally different vibe and feel. It just can't be replicated with 35mm film because it's not just one thing you need to tweak. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre looks like a realistic documentary, and it feels like one too. It's a gritty, visceral film in the same way as The Last House on the Left, which strangely also had a chainsaw in it. Now fast forward to the 2022 remake, where they used an Arri Alexa Mini and shot it digitally. The difference is night and day. The remake loses the grit of the original. It's visually sharper, with smoother skin tones and more controlled lighting. But this strips away the horror of the original. It feels too staged, too controlled, whereas the original felt like a nightmare caught on camera. And the surprising part is the 1974 version has very little gore. It's what you don't see that you're terrified about. The infamous meat hook scene is an example of this. In the original, you don't see much. Your imagination does the work. The 2003 remake focuses more on gore and explicit violence. In the original, you feel like you're really there on location in a real place with really scary people. You don't feel the same in any of the sequels. The most direct comparison has to be made with the first sequel, made 10 years later, also directed by Tobe Hooper. They did try to give it a similar gritty feel, but they changed the tone. It leaned into dark humor and even some camp. The sequel had over-the-top lighting and felt more like a horror comedy. It has its moments though. The sequel also used real music, whereas the original had this unnerving documentary-like soundscape. Some of it had to do with the times. The original captured the disillusionment of the 70s post-Vietnam era. By the time the sequel came in the late 80s, the world had changed. The look of films and the tone of films had changed in general. The sequels after that are further removed from the original. They're all deliberate departures from the first film, including the camera movement. The original film has mostly handheld camera work. When they use dolly shots, like this shot, my favorite from the film, Daniel Pearl is lying on a dolly while his dolly grip is pushing him under the swing. They used a wide 8mm Zeiss standard speed lens, so the house grew larger and larger as we approach it. To get its crane shots, they used a DIY wooden crane. The handheld camera work feels shaky and unstable, like the audience is being dragged through the scenario with the characters. This frenetic energy made Leatherface seem unstoppable and larger than life. In the remake, the camera is often more stable, less erratic. While this made for cleaner compositions, it also lessened the raw energy. Leatherface feels more like the typical slasher villain. Ultimately, we also have to talk about Tobe Hooper's unique vision. Hooper worked closely with unknown or inexperienced actors, which added to the unpredictability of the scenes. Their genuine discomfort and fear are palpable on screen. It's incredibly hard to replicate that kind of authenticity with more experienced actors.
Oh no, it is perfect like this.
Take the climactic scene of Sally's escape in the original. The rawness of the 16mm film, the shaky camera, the oppressive heat, it all makes you feel every moment of her terror. In contrast, the 2003 remake's version of this escape feels choreographed, more like an action scene. I'm not saying it's bad, but it isn't the original. So why can't they remake the Texas Chainsaw Massacre properly? Because the original's power lies in its imperfections. The 16mm reversal film process, its raw soundscape, its minimalist lighting, and its unpolished mise-en-scenes. No amount of high-budget gloss can recreate the primal fear of the original, but I can recreate that too every week. Amazing videos about great movies. Click to keep riding the wave.